No, you don't.
Well, it went straight to my throat. It's funny, I couldn't talk hardly, but my throat was red, but it wasn't hurting like strep throat. It's really weird.
About how mine was.
Is that
But
how yours was?
I didn't go to get tested. I just knew that I couldn't talk. I really don't think it was COVID. Because I didn't get it till I slept all night with the cold air coming into me. So.
You know, it's interesting though, that about Tuesday, Wednesday, we had 3 people coming out with COVID at about the same time.
From the last
This
week?
week, this last week.
Okay.
So
That I can see a common thread.
So it makes you think that somewhere last weekend they got contact with someone.
Well, everybody went to the same party last weekend, apparently.
Now, I didn't get him in. I didn't get into that.
I didn't get in on
I didn't either, I'm glad I didn't.
Oh. Well, it's not like there's a billion people in here. All right.
Did your nephew say anything about coming to the breakfast today?
Not really, other than they're like, oh, this biscuit is huge. They were expecting like party size. Yeah. It was a lot bigger than that. So, I mean, outside that, they didn't really say anything about it. Well, good morning, everyone. There's going to be some decline of population today, at least in attendance today. But there are a lot of sick that we need to be praying for. Tina has been mentioned, Brenda, Tammy, Jacob, Randy, in being around them. Also, I just found out my sister tested positive for COVID. However, she phrased it like, I went to the doctor and I tested positive. And I'm like, that's really vague. What do you mean? She did not like that. Be praying for them. Also, Sandy is visiting his daughter and son-in-law in Nashville. So be praying for his travels back. Outside of that, I mean, it's a rough time for everyone. So continue to keep them through your prayers, but also, is there anybody that we do need to add to our prayers? Okay, we'll find out in time. We'll ask Lum, if he will, lead us in an opening prayer, and then we'll begin with our Bible study.
Father, we once again thank you for the opportunity to get together to open your book, to learn more from it. We pray, Father, that as we study this book of Isaiah, we can learn from the examples and the lessons there to help enrich our lives here on earth. Thank you, Father, that we have this congregation, and thank you, Father, that we have the freedom to meet here in all peace. We pray, Father, that we continue to be able to meet here with no disturbances whatsoever. We pray, Father, for our leaders of our country that make the laws, that can keep the laws, that are all freedom for us to do your work and be available. Pray, Father, for those, we know we have many in our congregation that are sick. Pray, Father, that your healing hand can reach down to them, and that be thy will, that be well soon, and be back with us. Pray, Father, for those that are going in life situations as well, Father, that you would help them to be strong in their lives and continue to improve their life situations in the future. We pray, Father, you be with our teacher this morning, that we can relate to us things he's studying and can help us in our lives as well. We ask these things, Father, in your Son's holy name. Amen.
Okay, so we are on lesson 9. You know what? The battery's dead on this. That explains it. We're on lesson 9 in the book, and over the past couple of weeks, we've been looking at Isaiah, specifically some of the prophecies that have occurred Let me put these batteries in because I can't focus on two things at one time. Why? Do we have a key or something? I can't open this. Something flat. Oh yeah, that works. Thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you. It's going to be that kind of Sunday today. That's good. Much better. Okay. We are good to go. No, it occurred to me in your prayer, I was like, oh, the power of prayer. Power. What if there's no power in the thing? So, yeah, it was dead. So I think you commented a few weeks back, it's cutting in and out. Yeah, that's probably it. Oh, really?
Yeah, because the picture would stop.
Oh, well, it might be.
Yeah, I felt bad after that.
That's okay. Okay, so we're on lesson number 9, and today we're talking about a really interesting concept of God's use of nations in view of the grand scheme of the plan of salvation and the grand scheme of man's existence. And Isaiah 13, I think, works really, really well with where we are for Revelation. We ended Wednesday with the phrase, new heavens, new earth, and we looked at this idea of the day of the Lord. Well, that kind of phrasing is going to come back in Isaiah 13, but it's in view of something else. It's not the Roman Empire that's in consideration like Revelation, but rather in the beginning of the text, it's going to tell us a couple of things as how God casts judgment on His people, but also we're going to see from chapter 14, we're going to see how God is going to cast judgment on the nations that cast judgment on God's people, if that makes sense. And there's a couple of ways that people have phrased this before. They would say like God is using this nation as a vehicle to bring about His will. I've heard that phrasing before. I know some people would explain it like, well, God rules over everything, so if He wanted to punish His people with another nation, He has all the right to do that. Well, there's complexities when we say it that way. Because if I'm not a believer in the Bible, what you've done to me is you've turned me off from God. Because I don't think, well, let me paraphrase what they would think. So you're telling me God can just pick a nation and He can cast judgment on another nation using another nation that might be a lot more wicked, a lot more evil than what His people are, and you're telling me that's okay? So it's okay to sin with a sin and continue sinning so that people can continue to sin. That's how it comes across. That's not what's going on, though. And we're going to see that not only do God's people have regulations they have to follow, but even the nations that God uses to be as a vessel of judgment, so to speak, they too have responsibilities in view of God's ways. So we're going to see that as we go through Isaiah 13 and 14. And just because, well, do y'all want to read or do you want me to read? Okay, then I'll read then. Okay. I'll read for it today. I'm actually working on that problem. We just don't have the solution yet. We'll carry around a mic and have a talk show and everything. So the introduction, nations are accountable. God knows all things. Because He is omniscient, He's able to declare the end from the beginning and from ancient times things that are not done yet, as per Isaiah 46 and verse 10. Although He gives special attention to His people, God is nonetheless aware of all men. Because He is completely just, He will ultimately hold everyone accountable for their actions. As the Apostle Paul noted, there is no partiality with God, for as many as have sinned without the law will also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. Romans 2:11-12. God will indeed bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Ecclesiastes 12:14. Importantly, the Lord's judgment is not limited to the end of time.
God provides both punishments and rewards in this life. As the prophet Daniel observed, God changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings, as per Daniel 2:21. In other words, God is sovereign. Working behind the scenes, God used both individuals and nations to accomplish his will. Sometimes those used by God punished his people, for example, the Babylonians in Habakkuk 1:5-11. And sometimes those used by God blessed his people. For example, he would call it, in Isaiah's text, my servant Cyrus in 44:28. Regardless, those used by God acted freely. The one who knows all things deftly steered the tiller of history to bring about his desired results. As our lesson text will show, however, those used by God are not exempt from his judgment. This was true of Babylon, the nations God allowed to conquer Judah, or the nation God allowed to conquer his people. Addressing God's people, Isaiah reminded them that God's reach extended to all, even their potential conquerors. Webb suggested the words spoken against the nations are actually for Israel's ears. The nations themselves almost certainly never heard them, and they are spoken to remind Israel that no matter what the nations do to her, her final destiny is secure. Because it is the Lord, not they, who shapes the course of history. He is the Lord of nations, and his judgment on them has its ultimate goal, the salvation of his people. Despite Babylon's strength, it would be defeated. God remained in control, thus he declared in Isaiah 13:11, I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their iniquity. I will halt the arrogance of the proud, and I will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. Judgment was coming. Even Babylon could not escape. Now, just kind of a story to lead us into this. I think it's interesting. This week, I was talking to one of the instructors. Is anyone teaching kids? Or no? Okay, you've got a few. He told a story about this guy, a very buff guy. He's maybe in his late 20s, early 30s, and he decided to buy a motorcycle. He sells Lamborghinis, so he's a top salesman somewhere in the U.S., so he could afford this. So he decides to get the best motorcycle out there. The problem is he never got a motorcycle license. He just bought a motorcycle, decided to ride it, and he ended up going through the back windshield of a car when he was just in the parking lot. Well, he was all bruised up and battered and scratched and stuff, didn't break any bones. And the man I was talking to, he was talking to this guy, and he said, did that motorcycle wreck really bring any thoughts to your mind? He's like, I don't get what you're saying. What do you mean? Well, what if you had died? Would you be prepared for whatever lied on the other side of eternity for you? And the guy's response was, well, I'm strong enough to where I'm still here, right? So I have nothing to worry about. Well, there's a problem with that mentality, especially in view of nations. And even though we live in probably what could be the greatest nation on earth, a lot of things that have transpired in the past couple of decades isn't making it per se the greatest place on earth anymore. And just because bad policies are in the government doesn't necessarily mean that the people in that nation are wicked. Hence, we're here. There are a lot of other thousands of millions of other people who are worshiping God on this very day in spirit and in truth according to his word. And there are a lot of religious individuals, religious-minded. So there is some good. But if a nation goes corrupt, if the military becomes corrupt, if the policies that are being passed are corrupt and the people themselves are becoming corrupt, guess what? We're no better than ancient Israel. We're no better than ancient Babylon. And there comes this stance where we feel like we're safe from technology wars or nuclear wars or any kind of battles. And if anybody came up against us, we flex our arm and say, well, come on, take us on. Well, in the grand scheme of things, none of that matters. Because everyone's human. You're just as human as the next individual. And I believe one of the things that's going to be talked about in Isaiah 14, even though we're not getting to it in the text, it can be the case that a particular ruler comes to power, and we'll say, for instance, World War II, Adolf Hitler, and it seems like that he is just untouchable, and no one can get to him. But he's just as mortal as all the rest of us when it comes to the end of the day. Granted, he's gone, so it just goes to show he's mortal. But sometimes we view people in that light. If they have popularity, or if they have riches, or if they're just very famous in the world for some reason, we seem to think of them as untouchable. And sometimes they even perceive themselves as being untouchable. No, not when God's involved, and God's involved with everything. What God is going to do with Babylon is He's going to bring to light, look, you may have conquered my people, but you're about to suffer the consequences of violating my law because you presumed that you were invincible, and you were not. We've got to be very, very careful not to have this kind of attitude that Babylon has. So Isaiah 13, this is where our text begins. And I think what we'll do, we'll read through the sections of the text. I'm not really going to read the commentary per se, but I will bring out a couple of points that the commentator does bring up. But Isaiah 13, beginning in verse 1, the burden against Babylon which Isaiah the son Amos saw. Lift up your banner on the high mountain, raise your voice to them. Wave your hand that they may enter the gates of the nobles. I have commanded my sanctified ones. I have also called my mighty ones for my anger, those who rejoice in my exaltation. The noise of the multitude in the mountains like that of many people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of the nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts musters the army for battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven. The Lord and his weapons of indignation to destroy the whole land. Well, for the day of the Lord is at hand, and will come as a destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will be limp, every man's heart will melt, and they will be afraid. Pangs and sorrows will take hold of them, and they will be they will be in pain as a woman in childbirth. They will be amazed at one another, and their faces will be like flames. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel in both the wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. He will destroy its sinners from it, and the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its goings forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will halt the arrogance of the proud, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I will make the mortal more rare than fine gold, and a man more than a golden wedge of an Ophir. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. It shall be as a hunted gazelle, and as a sheep that no man takes up. Every man will turn to his own people, and everyone will flee to his own land. In the beginning of this, just take note, this is not against God's people. It identifies this in verse 1, who this particular prophecy or this forecoming is against. The burden against Babylon. And this isn't just like, oh, my neck is irritating me. This is something that could end your life type burden. This is very critical. And it's interesting some of the language that's used. We've talked about this a lot in the Revelation, or in the study for Revelation. These phrases, verse 6 and verse 9, the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord. This is some kind of judgment of sorts, and for some reason we seem to immediately think, oh, this is end of time. No, it's not. This is against Babylon. Now, granted, Babylon is not in existence today, at least not in the way that it was framed under Nebuchadnezzar and those kings. But we have to take into consideration sometimes this particular language can be used for judgment on a nation as it's being used for Babylon. And when you notice some of the things that we tend to relate to the end of time and the end of the world, when someone talks about the end of time, it's not uncommon for them to make mention of the stars of heaven will darken, the moon will turn to blood, the sun will no longer shine. Well, that's interesting. That same language is used in Acts 2 when the church came into existence. But it doesn't say anything about the sun suddenly just stopped shining its light and no one could see the sky anymore. It was a day. It was a sunny day as far as I know. It could have been raining that day. I don't know. But these are all figures of speech. If we turn this into a literal interpretation, we're totally misrepresenting the text. And this particular burden that's thrown down here, if we think about what happens in the canals of time, who did take out the Babylonian Empire? Okay. Not sure is not correct. It's the Medes and Persians. The Medes and Persians had, in the Egyptian, well, I bring up the Egyptians. The Egyptian Empire, they used to have co-regent rulers. in the upper and lower kingdom of Egypt, and they would rule collectively together. They'd have to address issues together to resolve them. But with the Medes and Persians, it's that same kind of co-regent thing. And when you see the beginning of the Medes taking out the Babylonians, it seems like they had a lot more influence till the Persians came along. And then when we read through Esther, that's during that period when the Persians had the upper hand of a lot of things. But they tended to share responsibility a lot through this. Now it's interesting, the definition, or at least the way that these people are defined, these people cause problems. It says they were amazed, verse 7 and 8. They were amazed, their faces will be like flames, and these are the people who are facing this kind of persecution. Have you ever seen someone so terrified that their face changes colors? Most of the time we would say, well, your face is pale white. Why are you afraid? These were not pale white. Rather, it was kind of like a glowing red type color. Now, I've never necessarily been so afraid that my face changes color, but I have seen children who have been terrified before, where they'll be shaking and suddenly their face will be like burnt red, like David or, your name just left me, Jim. David and Jim, their shirt. I mean, that's kind of uncommon, but they've got to be scared out of their wits for that to happen. That's not just a normal occurrence of fear. This is someone who is genuinely terrified. And it says this is the reason why they will be punished. Verse 11, for its evil, the world for its evil. And at that time, it's not necessarily talking about the world as in the globe, but in the known world, so to speak. So it's talking about the Babylonian Empire. Punish them for their iniquity. The halt of their arrogance is proud, and I will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. This is something to take into consideration. The proverb writer, and it brings it up at the end of the text, pride cometh before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. This is what's in view. Now, there's a lot of application we can make with this, but let's continue with the text, just so we can see what's going to be the characteristic of these individuals, because these people, they mean business. Beginning in verse 13, and then I'll open it up after we talk about the Medes, or 17. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, against the Babylonians, who will not regard silver, and as for gold, they will not delight in it. Their bows will dash the young men to pieces, and they will have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not spare children, and Babylon, the glory of kingdoms. The beauty of the Chaldeans' pride will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, and it shall not be inhabited, nor will it be settled from generation to generation, nor will the Arabian pitch tents there, nor will the shepherds make their sheepfolds there. But the wild beast and the desert that will lie there, and their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches will dwell there, and wild goats will caper there. The hyena will howl in their citadels, and the jackal in their pleasant places. Her time is near to come, and her days will not be prolonged. That's kind of a nice way to end the whole thing. Well, now that you hear this, any day now. That's very unsettling. The attitude of these Medes, I think it's interesting just from the kind of people that God chose. These people don't really care much about money. In fact, it says there in the beginning in verse 17, they won't regard silver. As for gold, they will not delight in it. In terms of life, they care nothing. They care nothing about foreigners. This is my land. If you got a problem with it, well, you'll just have to talk to my sword. And that was their attitude. Very stern individuals. And in fact, it gives a relationship not only about the Medes and Persians, but also what's going to happen to the Babylonians. When I think about the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, that particular scene where there's this hellfire and brimstone coming down on the city, and it's just being obliterated into nothing. And then God takes that kind of imagery and turns it to the Babylonians and says, well, just like they were destroyed, you too will be destroyed. Now, I think maybe fire from above might be a little bit more terrifying than by the sword. Then again, I don't like pointy things, so it might actually work the other way around. But if something is equated with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, this has got to be a catastrophic event. And this is not a pretty event either. It almost seems like we'd rather perish like Sodom and Gomorrah rather than what's coming here. And I don't really know how to put that into adequate terms, but it's supposed to scare them to death. I think it's interesting, one other point and then discussion. How could the Babylonians know about Sodom and Gomorrah if there wasn't something already in circulation about the history of Sodom and Gomorrah in view of the Israelites? And the point that I'm trying to make is a lot of people say that a lot of the stories and the histories of the Israelite people did not actually come into existence until maybe like the 12th or the 10th or even the 8th or the 7th century BC. And they say because it's so far away from when the events actually happened, they're not credible. Well, the Babylonians can't shake in fear if they know nothing about the Sodom and Gomorrah people. There had to be a history in existence that talked about these events. Otherwise, what you're saying is Sodom and Gomorrah. What's that? What happened? A lot of people had to know this. I think it's interesting. Rahab talks about, we've heard how you overthrew the kings Sihon and Og, and how the Egypt was decimated, and God led you out of Egypt. That word had to be spoken and shared amongst a lot of people and recorded down. Otherwise, this has no relevance. So I think it's interesting, not only is God sending judgment to a people who are not his own, but he also brings up a history that their own people would have no association with unless that there were historical documents around. So any thoughts or ideas, or at least anything in regards to the Medes or to the Babylonians? This is not the end of the story. Sadly, chapter 14 should be combined with chapter 13, but any thoughts? Okay. So, God uses a wicked people as his tool of deliverance or judgment. Now, these people have turned haughty, and God is going to use another nation to overthrow these people, and they take no prisoners. But what does this mean about God's people? Because right now, those who have taken the captives captive, they are going to be turned into spoils of war, and they're going to be taken into captivity. So what's going to happen to these new captive captors of the one who's been taken captive by a new captor? Well, that's what Isaiah 14 is going to explain. The Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and will still choose Israel and settle them in their own lands. The stranger will be joined with them, and they will cling to the house of Jacob. I'm in verse 1 of chapter 14. Then the people will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them for servants. Maids in the land of the Lord's, they will take them captive, whose captives they were, and rule over their oppressors. For it will come to pass, when the Lord gives you rest from your sorrow and your fear, and the hard bondage in which you were made to serve, you will take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, and say, how the oppressor has ceased, and the golden city ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers. He who struck the people in wrath with a continual stroke. He who ruled the nations in anger is persecuted, and no one hinders. The whole earth is at rest and quiet, and they break forth into singing. Indeed, the cypress trees rejoice over you, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were cut down, no woodsman has come up against us. Hell from beneath is excited about you to meet you at your coming. It stirs up the dead for you, all the chief ones of the earth. It is raised up from their thrones, all the kings of the nations. They shall all speak and say to you, have you also become as weak as we? Have you become like us? Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, and the sound of your stringed instruments, the maggot is spread over you, and the worms cover you. How you were fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning! How you were cut down to the ground, for you who weaken the nations! For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. Okay. A couple of interesting things, and we'll talk about just the general idea and view of Isaiah, or of Israel, and then I want to look at this from Babylon's perspective, because one of the bad things about this text is every time we hear the word Lucifer, it's not a king of Babylon that shows up or that we think of in our mind. We end up thinking of the devil. But there's nothing in that text that says this is about the devil, especially in view of chapter 13 and 14 go together. This is about something pertaining to Babylon. This is not about suddenly Satan. So, in the beginning of this, I think it's interesting. The Lord will have mercy on Jacob. Keep that in mind because there's a really powerful principle that God is presenting here. Those who have taken Israel captive, they will become servants to Israel. So, in a sense, the oppressor, or those who were oppressed, now have power over the nations, so to speak. They now become victorious over those who took them captive. Verse 3, it'll come to pass in the day of the Lord. What's the day of the Lord in view? Go back to chapter 13, verse 6 and 9. The burden of Babylon, the destruction of the Babylonian nation, the day of the Lord. When it comes, it will bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will receive rest from their sorrows, and the fear and hard bondage in which you were made to serve. You'll take up this proverb against the king of Babylon. I do want to focus on verse 3. You recall how in Revelation 21 it talks about God will, there will be no more tears, no more crying, no more sorrow, no more pain. Guess what God is saying to the nation of Israel right now after the Babylonian oppressor is cast down? There will be no more sorrow, you will rest, there will be no more tears, your burden will be gone. These two have to be taken in view. We're talking about the same kind of event going on. Not the same people, but the same kind of event. God's people are delivered from their oppressors. And when this happens, then it creates this, going back to Wednesday night, this new environment where it's like this new heaven and new earth type feel. Oppression's gone. We're victorious. Okay, what's going to happen now? Well, that's what the rest of the text is. But I think it's interesting it uses the same kind of terminology. Did you have a comment? Or oh, I thought you raised your hand. Sorry. So this proverb that comes up, it talks about the earth resting, everyone bringing up this idea, you thought you were invincible, and now you're not. I think verse 9 through 11 is actually very poetic. This is an interesting way of saying, you've had it coming, buddy. Hell from beneath is excited about you, excited for you coming to meet him. That's not something you hear every day. And if you do hear something like that today, normally it's used in a very vulgar type manner of, well, I have nothing to fear if I die away from the Lord. And typically it's people of ignorance. In view of the Babylonian Empire, hell is excited to meet you. This is not talking about the final resting place. This is simply talking about where the dead abide. And this could be taken in a couple of different ways. But poetically, it stirs up the dead to meet you. The chief ones of the earth has raised up their thrones. They'll speak to you and say, when they meet you in this place of the dead, have you become just like us? Were you always as weak as us this entire time? And what this is trying to prove is the humanity of this great, vast empire. At the end of the day, we have to realize, all finances aside, accomplishments aside, what your role in life is aside, you're a human being just like all of us. And we all have the same kind of end in the terms of physical death. However, what can be affected is how we've lived in this life to determine where we go once we die. That's what is brought to view here. Now, it's interesting, not only is he saying you become like us, you're human just like the rest of us, but verse 12 and 13, it brings up that same idea of how pride has been the problem of Babylon from the beginning and tried to exalt himself to say, well, I'm greater than the creator of the universe. I think it's interesting that's brought up because whenever you look in the book of Daniel, and you see Nebuchadnezzar whenever he exalts himself above God, and then he has to wander in the wilderness for a small period of time. And God told Nebuchadnezzar, because you have exalted yourself, you're going to lose your throne, you're going to lose everything, you're going to become like one of the beasts in the field. And God gave him that time of humility, then he regained that throne. It seems like Nebuchadnezzar would have continued sharing this story, or at least it would have been passed down, hence it's in Scripture, so it was important. But that same story of how a king who was, and then he became dethroned and then reinstalled as king, would have been circulated through the Babylonian kings And it seems like this particular individual, Lucifer, whoever it is, whether it is a specific king of Babylon or if it's just representing the totality of the Babylonian kingship, their attitude overall may have been, no one can touch this. Well, God showed them. It happened to one of your kings, and God could restore him back, but you've gotten to a place to where you're not going to receive anything back. In fact, your kingdom's going to be destroyed, your kingship is going to be destroyed, and everything that you once cherished and held value to means nothing. You're going to be just like all the other people that you have oppressed. In view of everything for us, I think it's interesting, though Israel is in a time of captivity, and granted their sinfulness is what led them into captivity, we can still undergo trials or still undergo certain burdens and still find deliverance in some way through those burdens. We might still be going through an issue, but something that we perceived as an issue is no longer an issue in God's eyes. And what God says is, if you're willing to turn back to me, I'll protect you, I'll provide for you. And this is in the middle of the time frame where, if you look at Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, this is when God is culminating or trying to bring about the coming of the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man who receives the kingdom from the Ancient of Days. And the saints and him will reign on high forever. And the idea is this power over the nations idea. God ultimately delivers his people. Though they're still in captivity to another nation, no one can hinder someone who wants to be obedient to God. No one can hinder them from having a relationship with God if they choose to live righteously, even under oppression. I think it's interesting, Paul parallels this from the individual Christian walk, that he rejoices in being a prisoner of the Lord. And then we think of how many liberties we have of not being a literal prisoner. But then Paul says, this hasn't brought me under bondage, rather it's given me liberty in Christ. It seems counterintuitive when you first hear it, but the idea is I don't have to worry about those sins, and no matter what state that I find myself in, I still have a reason to rejoice. That's kind of hard for us to imagine, and going under Israel's view here, being in captivity, could we still have that positivity? Though things aren't very positive, can we still find assurance in God? I think it's a powerful lesson there. So any thoughts or ideas from any of this, or any questions on the terminology? Because this is very poetic. Do you know? You don't have anything?
Been talking about the day in the Lord in different parts here, and I don't think, maybe it's not a specific time, maybe it's a specific action that's going to happen because of
That is true. That is true. A lot of people actually wouldn't see it that way because they would say, well, it says day. Well, when you think about it, it does, in a sense, it has to occur at a certain time. But I think that's missing the whole point. It's the action of judgment on a nation. When it happens is irrelevant. It's going to happen. But how are you going to prepare yourself before those things take place? So that's a really good observation. Any other thoughts?
Mentioned in Genesis 19, I was able to my son in the mornings, solidifies, the Bible's consistent in what it says. And like we talked about, they thought it was fiction before. That's what they just kept, and that's now fiction. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah to kind of justify their self-satisfaction. But yet it's proved by looking back. It kind of worries me now that they can look back at their history, but
We try to get rid of history.
now I'm hearing that our generation, they're trying to destroy our history. And if they destroy history and the roots, we won't know where we came from. The generations. If they were able to look back at their history and justify what could happen.
typically the people who try to destroy history always end up worse than the people of the past because they choose to ignore consequences, and that is turning a lot into what's going on today. But I do think it's interesting, not only in Babylon's case, but even Jesus talking to Chorazin after he had done some miracles. He said, "Woe unto you, Chorazin, if the miracles that have been done in you have been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented long ago if they had this kind of evidence presented before them. And you choose to ignore this evidence, it's going to be more fearful or woeful for you on the day of judgment than for them." And what it goes to show is that God does take into account evidences presented to specific individuals. In Babylon's case, this had to be historic, otherwise this wouldn't be scary at all. It'd be like, did I miss something? But it was historical. And even in the New Testament time, Jesus affirms this did happen. If we say that it didn't happen, what we're calling Jesus is a liar. And that presents a lot of problems. But even Jesus brings up that point. And it might be good to note as well, whenever you look in Jude or even Romans chapter 1, and it talks about the idea of not only sexual indulgences, which is typically used against homosexuality to show God doesn't approve it at all, but it shows other things, lust, pride, arrogance, and it shows this haughtiness of, again, going back to the Babylonian perspective, no one can touch us. We need to be very, very careful not to ever think that way, because when we do, I mean, it's only a matter of time before God says, that's it, your chances are gone. And then at the end of things, really, who's the biggest loser?
Verse 18, though, that the young man simply killed the bows and dashed the young man's faces. And it's even going to take the unborn children from the womb to kill those as well as the mothers. And we will not spare the children. Really, to me, that's really something to think about. This, the innocent, all the innocent people there in the lesson, unborn children. And, that's when it talks about that, it'd be scary.
Well, this it kind of brings up a further point. It's not only scary for the people who are going to come into this, but I tend to think of Egypt as well in view of this. One person in a family, especially the one who leads the family, and this could be a mother or father, it might even be a grandparent at times, the way that you train other individuals can have catastrophic events on the rest of your family if you don't take God seriously. That's showing here in a physical sense, Babylon is going to be destroyed because they chose to usurp themselves above God. And that, in theory, is impossible. Sounds like a great theory if I'm in the world, but it's impossible. It's an absurdity.
And one more, he said he had no pity on the fruit of the womb. This is just another example that life existed before birth.
Yeah, because when you add the next phrase to it, it's like, how can fruit of the womb be a child? Because every seed produces after its own kind, and the seed of man, a human, produces a human, no matter what state. Yeah. So that's definitely a verse to help to show God sees it as equivalency. Why do we think it's something completely different? It's a good observation. Any other thoughts, comments? Okay. Don't be like Babylon. Be like God's people. Even you find yourself in an oppressed state, it's okay. God still cares for you. Just depend on Him. Trust in Him. Everything works out in the end. That's the ultimate say-so of Isaiah 13 and 14. Thank you for your time and attention. We'll be back in about 15 minutes, Lord willing. And thank you for being here. Thanks.